My guest today is Vladislav Bogorov.
I'm the only certified welder who has won 4 cases before the European Court of Human Rights as a lawyer. Yes, this is the same court Britain wants to get out of these days. And obviously, I have a law degree, and I also have a Master of Science in Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies. I was born under socialism in the People's Republic of Bulgaria. So I was born under one of the biggest social engineering experiments of them all, socialism. I'm the author of about 300 articles in different newspapers, and I'm a co-author of When History Had Other Plans, a book. Right. A book about the failure of different social engineering projects. Environmentalism is among them.
Okay, and by the way, you did serve as a tank man, it says here, on a Soviet T-55?
Yes, they were outdated even back then when I served in the beginning of the 1990s for 18 months. But to my surprise, they're still occasionally using them in Ukraine, the Russians, I mean.
Okay.
It's the most massively produced tank in history, if I remember correctly. Something like, if memory doesn't fail me, something like 50,000 have been, more than 50,000 have been manufactured. And this was the tank with which they mostly crushed the Prague Spring. This is the tank they used to massacre all these people at the Tiananmen Square in Beijing. And it has been used in many other places. Now it's still in use in Ukraine, although it's horribly antiquated. In the book, I claim that environmentalism is to blame for the global warming. And people are startled to this, hearing this, but it's actually very easy to substantiate. And that's because there is only one way to reach net zero. This is the Holy Grail. And this is to find an energy source that doesn't emit CO2 and that is cheaper than coal. Now, they promote they're against nuclear, as we know, the environmentalists, and they promote other policies that will never get us anywhere near net zero. For example, if all the humans all over the world stop eating meat and stop flying, and insulate their homes and all that, and all the niceties, everything they protest for, we will never reach net zero because we will still need energy. And this energy mostly comes from fossil fuels these days. So why it has to be cheaper than coal? This is the rub of the problem. Of course, we can talk about physics, politics, and all that, but ultimately, the problem is one of economics. Because even if renewables are adopted in the West, even the environmentalists manage to twist our arms in the West to adopt their favorite pet source of energy, this will never happen in the third world. And the third world is most of the world these days. So imagine a country like Afghanistan, where the central government barely exists. It rules in Kabul, if that. So how would this government impose police, implement a policy which requires the Afghanis, who are poor to begin with, not to use fossil fuels, but to use renewables, which will lower their standard of living because it will make energy more expensive, but energy is needed for everything else. Energy is needed for transportation, for production of things, including agriculture. It's for heating, for you name it. So if the price of energy goes up, the price of everything else goes up. And Afghanistan is just an example. I mean, Pakistan next door is not much different. The central government could hardly make the local tribesmen ditch the wood and the coal and the rest of the fossil fuels and use renewables if this will make them even poorer. And the same goes obviously for Africa, for Latin America, everywhere basically. So it's never going to happen. And unless we totally deindustrialize. And to totally deindustrialize, people don't realize that, means actually to lower the population to pre-industrial levels. As far as I remember, something like 500 million people lived on Earth before the Industrial Revolution. Today there are 8 billion, so 15 out of every 16 people have to disappear. And people would not willingly commit to die, to starve to death or something similar, if for the sake of an environmentalist quest. This will never happen. I mean, this could conceivably only happen in a country like North Korea, because North Korea is a totalitarian state. If a substantial part of the population dies, starves to death there, as it did actually, something like 10 to 15% of the North Koreans starved to death in the 90s, the government will still be in power because it's a totalitarian government. But this will never happen all over the world, where the governments are weak, anemic, corrupt, next to non-existent. And even in the West, it's doubtful that it will happen. Obviously, the Westerners, we will not starve to death if our standards of living are dramatically lowered. But even here, it is doubtful that this will fly, given that we could simply vote for another government. So it's an impossible dream to imagine that you implement a new energy source that doesn't emit CO2 unless it is cheaper than coal. And if it's cheaper than coal, obviously it will be accepted everywhere, with or without environmentalism, simply because it's cheaper. People prefer what is cheap to what is expensive. It's very simple. So this narrows down the choice, really, because there is only one energy source that fits the bill, that doesn't emit CO2 and could easily be cheaper than coal, and that's nuclear energy. Now, the present day nuclear energy we have is not cheaper than coal, but that is only because its development has been artificially hindered, mostly by the environmentalist movement, because they have tapped into this fear of all things nuclear. They are milking it, and they are doing their best to scare the public. And this matters, because if the public is scared, it means that this industry is heavily regulated, which means innovation is stifled. So all things are connected. And the result of the activity of the environmentalists regarding nuclear is that we have outdated nuclear reactors that are basically refined 1950s models. Yes, these days they have additional safety systems. They have a greater degree of redundancy. Obviously, they're computerized, but the basics are still the same. They're still pressurized. They use water. The fuel is in form of rods. You have additional rods that are lowered into the active zone. And all this is incredibly complicated. It makes them unreliable. And to make them reliable, obviously, you have to duplicate and triplicate and all the systems many times to make sure that even if in worst case scenario, one of the systems will work, and you have many sets of pumps and valves, and the plumbing is incredibly complicated, and you have to have these protective domes made of reinforced concrete if the steam escapes, because the water boils at 100 degrees, which means that to keep it liquefied at higher temperature, you have to pressurize it, which means that it's easier to escape if there is a leak somewhere. And for this, you have to have this gigantic dome, because the volume of the water increases, say, 1,000 times when it escapes. And all this drives the design of the present nuclear reactors, in a wrong direction. They're ever bigger, ever more expensive, expensive also to maintain. And they're also, on top of it, very inefficient. So they're inefficient, first of all this, because of all this machinery, but also because they utilize something like 2% of the fuel. That's abysmal. And if to this we add the inefficiency added by converting the heat energy produced by the reactor into steam and then to electricity through the turbines, basically it's a steam engine, which efficiency is around 40%. And if to this we add another 8 or so percent for the transmission of the electricity, we end up with less than 1% of the energy in the fuel utilized. That's it. I mean, it's really bad. But it's not surprising, because guess what? 250 years ago, when they began to develop the first steam engines, their efficiency was below 1%. So it's normal for a new technology to be inefficient. Today, like I said, the efficiency of most steam engines is around 40%. There, some go as up as 60, as high as 60. So the reason we are stuck still with the inefficient 1950s designs is, again, because this irrational fear of all things nuclear that the environmentalists are stoking. Is this the verb?
Yeah, stoking.
Stoking. Okay, English is not my mother tongue, so I'm struggling. Now, if the nuclear energy is developed, and there are already models that promise up to 50% efficiency, which would be an improvement of 5,000%, obviously nuclear will be way cheaper than coal. It will be the cheapest energy source. And the whole problem with the CO2 will disappear without the needs of the environmentalists. And when people hear this, they say, yeah, but what about Chernobyl? And what about Chernobyl, actually? Chernobyl was a really bad disaster, but paradoxically, Chernobyl proves that nuclear energy is safe. Because even in this worst case scenario, and things cannot be any worse than that. I mean, even if we tried, even if the reactor is intentionally sabotaged, even if we rig it with explosives, we cannot make it any worse. And even in this worst case scenario, yes, there was enormous economic damage, but in terms of lives lost, less than 100. That's all. And you can read about, you can find different figures out there, but these figures are taken out of thin air. There is no proof that more than 100 people ever died. Nobody knows the names of those people those thousands of people who supposedly died. And all this is based, all these figures that go above 100, they're based on presumptions that have no scientific basis. They're based on the so-called linear threshold hypothesis, according to which any radiation is damaging. And so I remember one author exemplified it in a very colorful way so that the public would understand, and I will borrow his example. So if you drink 100 shots of whiskey in one go, well, your chances of dying are basically 100%. The experiment has been done, and usually this is how it ends. Does this mean that if you drink one shot of whiskey per day, your chances of dying of it is 1%? Because 100 divided by 100 is 1. So if this was true, it would mean that if you repeat this shot a day after day for 100 days, on the 100th day, your chances of being dead would be 100%. You would be dead. The chances are you would be dead. But the experiment has been done all over the world by tens of millions of people who drink one shot a day, and obviously they don't die. So it's not the same to drink one shot a day or one for 100 days, or to drink 100 shots in one go. And the same applies to radiation. By the way, I'm sitting here and talking to you thanks to radiation, because I had cancer, and one of the treatments was radiotherapy. And I got relatively large doses of radiation, something like several thousand, equal to several thousand X-rays. Several times, by the way, not just once. And here I am, still around, not dead, obviously. So Chernobyl again proves that nuclear energy is safe. And to put this number of less than 100 people dead into perspective, let's consider how many die per year of, say, because we use coal. Never mind the CO2, just because of the other stuff that is released by the coal plants. Something like several millions per year, every year, die all over the world. So even if the CO2 was not a consideration, which we should find a way to stop using coal for that reason alone. And this whole story with the nuclear energy reminds us to the development of the computers. Because if we transport a computer engineer from the 1950s today, he would be baffled by the modern day computers. Back in the 1950s, they were using lamp valves. Most people today haven't heard of it. They were using electromagnetic relays. I mean, stuff that is really complicated and bulky and inefficient and unreliable and expensive. So you would end up with a computer costing several million dollars, which will be as large as a house, which will consume the electricity that is enough for a block of houses. And it will work for, say, half an hour, then some lamp somewhere will burn, and a team of highly paid technicians will go around this machinery to find which component has to be replaced. And in 2 hours, hopefully, they will fix it, and it will work for another half an hour or so. So these were the computers back then. Now compare this to the computers, the present-day computers. They cost next to nothing. And they don't break. And they're way more powerful. And they consume very little electricity. And all this happened without any environmentalism. It happened simply because the development of this industry was left to the market. And people wanted to make money. So the technology was not stifled. Compare this to the nuclear energy. If we transport the proverbial engineer from the 1950s today, he would be able to find a job in a modern nuclear power station. Because yes, he's not familiar with everything that we use today, but the basics are the same. He would understand, he would find his way around a modern nuclear power station very easily. And speaking of cheaper than coal, there were a few headlines about renewables that are cheaper than coal. Now I dissect some of these studies in When History Had Other Plans. By the way, this is the book, it exists. It's not a figment of my imagination. I will not go through all the accountancy gymnastics that has been used there to achieve certain results, because if you disregard certain expense, if you could prove anything. I will point out just one thing that is easy to grasp. If the renewables were cheaper than coal now, the problem would have been solved. The renewables would be implemented all over the world simply because everybody, like I said, prefers what is cheap. Nobody would bother anymore with using fossil fuels. So clearly that is not the case. Clearly that is not true. And all this tells us something about the environmentalist movement, because they push for policies that cannot possibly work, and they're against possibly policies that can work. So what does this tell us about the environmentalist movement? It tells us that environmentalism is not about the environment, that environmentalism uses the environment just as an excuse to push for certain policies, that it is just another social engineering project, like so many in the last 100 years, like socialism, Nazism, foreign aid, feminism, these days wokeism. And I found a quote from George Orwell, which was about socialism. And the quote is applicable to the modern environmentalists. He never had this in mind, but since it's, again, a social engineering movement, it turns out the quote applies to them as well. The war should... Oh, my eyes are not
a problem.
them anymore. The war should continue everlastingly and without victory. And really, their struggle to achieve net zero should continue everlastingly and without victory. Because if imagine that they win, imagine that they reach the net zero. This is their end. They have to disband, because they will have no reason to exist anymore. And if no reason to tell us how to live, no reason to... They need this thing to continue, but without victory. If this thing continues, they will obtain more and more power in the process. And they could find excuse for anything, because if the stakes are that high, the survival of the world, no hardship is big enough. I mean, everything should be swallowed. And if these are the facts, why the environmentalists are winning? And this, I would use the so-called nuclear waste as a case study, which explains why they're winning. So the first thing that we should know about nuclear waste is that it doesn't exist. What is called nuclear waste actually is unspent nuclear fuel. Remember the 2% of the fuel used? Well, the nuclear waste is the other 98%. It's not waste. It's mostly unspent uranium. There is some plutonium. There are a few other elements, different isotopes, short-lived. But mostly it's a valuable resource. And yet, if I talk about unspent nuclear fuel, people will be confused what I'm talking about. So even I, who knows that this is not waste, in order to be understood, I have to use this nuclear waste phrase. And even today, there are reactors that could easily utilize this so-called waste, and there will be more in the future. And even if there were no reactors that could ever utilize it, there's still not a problem, because the most radioactive parts of it have a shorter half-life, and they will disappear first. So it's the radioactivity of the unspent nuclear fuel falls exponentially. Because shorter life, half-life means that they decay faster. This is what makes them radioactive, but this also makes them disappear quicker than the rest. And eventually we are left with substances that are hardly radioactive. Most people don't know, for example, that they have a radioactive material in their houses, in their microwave. So the magnetrons typically are made using thorium. And thorium is one of those radioactive fuels. But its radioactivity is very low because its half-life is comparable to the age of the universe. It's billions upon billions of years. So it emits very little radiation. It's practically safe. And yet, despite all the figures, all the sourced material, all the arguments, at the end of the day, people are talking of nuclear waste, which means that the very language we use is actually working for the environmentalists. And it looks silly to us that they're fighting over words, but actually it's very clever. That's the best PR, because language shapes our thoughts. And the sad realization is that evidence does not matter. Kuhn wrote his famous book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, many decades ago. It's one of the most influential books out there. It's about how science progresses. And he demonstrated in this book that acceptance of what is true in science is not about evidence. It's about having authorities that support your theory. Authorities from the relevant scientific community. So if several eminent professors say that a theory is true, it is true. It's not about the evidence. And this applies even to, for example, to the theory of relativity. It was not accepted ultimately because of the evidence. For years, Einstein was not noticed. Why would anybody care about this nobody who is so arrogant as to say that Newton was wrong? I mean, obviously, some patent, he didn't even belong to the academia. He was a patent clerk, third class or something, somewhere. And he published in some obscure magazine. But there are even more striking examples. I mean, my favorite is Wegener. Wegener arguably is the greatest geologist who ever lived, who, by the way, wasn't even a geologist. He didn't have a degree in geology. He was a climatologist, by the way. And he came with his continental drift theory at the beginning of the 20th century. And the theory was not accepted until the 70s. Why? Yeah. Most of the evidence was presented already, was there at the beginning of the 20th century. It's quite actually easy to familiarize with the evidence because it's on any map of the world. You just have to compare the coastlines of Europe and Africa and Latin America, and they fit together perfectly. Not approximately, they fit perfectly. But the relevant scientific community didn't want to accept it, so the evidence was irrelevant for 70 years. And I haven't been a lawyer for 17 years, I've been a lawyer for 17 years, but I can tell you that things are not much different in the judiciary. You would think that the evidence is all that matters in a courtroom. And this is true as long as you present the evidence that is usually presented, that is considered acceptable. The moment you stray from what is normally done, the moment you claim something that sounds outrageous, something that hasn't been done before, the judges have their ways to ignore the evidence. They could rule it inadmissible. And even if it's admissible, they could just fail to address it in their decision, in the reasons they give. Or even if they address it, they could misinterpret it. They have many ways of ignoring pesky evidence. And of course, things are exactly the same in politics. I mean, just watch Yes Minister. If somebody wants to study politics, he just has to watch Yes Minister, because it's all there. It's not about evidence. It's about keeping certain allies along you, making coalitions, not alienating your friends, making sure that newspaper such and such will not publish something that will damage the reputation of a politician, this sort of thing. This is how things work in politics. And if evidence doesn't matter, what does? And I can think of several mechanisms that actually matter. And these mechanisms are all used by the environmentalists. Whether consciously or not, they work for them. So the first thing is that humans are programmed to try to fit in a community, not to alienate their peers, not to stick out, because if you stick out, you'll be ostracized, and historically that meant you would die, or your children will die. And well, the human culture didn't appear so that the humans can find some abstract, objective scientific truth. The human culture first appeared tens of thousands of years ago, so that human communities may bond together against another tribe, or against those animals that are trying to eat them, or something along those lines. They didn't have the luxury of pursuing the truth. They had to survive today so that maybe, hopefully, they will live to survive another day. That was it. And you would think that this doesn't matter in the West today, because you could be different and yet you will not die. And that is true. But at the same time, the West is full of lonely people without families. And the environmentalist movement, among other movements, flat earthers, by the way, would be another example I can think of, gives them this quasi family that they could belong to. They could feel part of a community. That's a psychological need. Incidentally, that's a serious thing. I'm not laughing at this, because recently I learned, to my surprise, that doctors who scan human brains, could actually find out by scanning it that brains of people who have been lonely have deteriorated because of loneliness. So it's really damaging to be lonely, it turns out. It's biologically damaging. Never mind the other aspects, the social aspects, the economical aspects, the psychological aspects. And then the West is also full of people whose lives are unfulfilling. Take, for example, so many women who have no children, and women have this need to care for somebody. So if they don't have children, their lives are empty. They don't have a purpose. But the environmentalist movement gives them the opportunity to care for the world. And again, I'm smiling, but actually it's no laughing matter, because it's serious. People have these needs. And it's not just women. The West is full of men who are looking for some purpose in life. And of course, the environmentalist movement gives many people the opportunity to blow off steam. There are certain types of behavior that are not acceptable. For example, it's not acceptable to shout at strangers. It's not acceptable to damage somebody's property, to spray paint over buildings. But if you're doing it to save the world, now that's a different matter. You are no longer a villain, you're a hero. And on top of it, there is the entertainment value, because the environmentalists give it's fun to be part of their happenings. I mean, there are people dressed as cows, there are people dressed as seals, there are people dressed as God knows what, and there is the show value is great, and also the entertainers are on their side. I mean, one of my favorite directors is Michael Moore. Now, I'm disgusted by his views. His political ideology disgusts me. But I have to confess, I enjoy his movies. They're well made. They're fun to watch. And you are laughing there. I suspect that you enjoy his movies as well, although you don't share his views. And on top of it all, humans also want to be safe. And the environmentalist movement, of course, is part of the woke movement, which possesses the fear factor. So, which wields the sword of the cancel culture. And people don't want to lose their jobs, not to mention Antifa, which is the terrorist arm of the leftists. So there is also the occasional intimidation and even violence. And by the way, these things are not new. People in the West think that they're new, but we who were born under socialism know better. Whenever I see those boys and girls who are stopping oil in the center of London and doing the other stuff they do, I think of my grandmother. So she lived in the capital of the Kingdom of Bulgaria before the communists took over, when the Red Army invaded the country. And they were all left-leaning. And I had conversations with her because once the communists took over, the party was over, and the extermination of people began in a small country like Bulgaria, a country of barely 7 million. According to Rommel, in Death by Government, the communists exterminated something like 200,000 people. To put this in perspective, the people murdered by the Chilean dictator Pinochet are around 3,000. And I talked to her, and I was not nice to her. I said, how could you carry water for the communists, given who they are and what they did? And you must have known, because before this happened in Bulgaria and throughout Eastern Europe, really, it happened in the Soviet Union, where tens of millions of people were exterminated. Socialism is deadly. And she was she kept saying, but we didn't know. And that she kept saying it was not about that. It was about participating with the others to make the world a better place. And they had these ideas. They used, for example, even some of the same words, progressivism, that was trendy at the time. And it was all about equality. It was not about, obviously, murdering people. It was about fairness. It was about all these movies. They used to watch Soviet movies. And in the Soviet movies, obviously, people were merry and singing merrily, gathering the plentiful crop and all that. And I remember this every time I see the young people today. The young people today want to be where the party is. And the party is where the environmentalism is. As it used to be back then, in the 40s, 1940s. For example, my grandmother met my grandfather there. He was also a lefty, only he was belonged to a different faction. But still, to be young meant to be there, to be with the other young people, and to feel significant, because people want to feel significant. And obviously, they were significant because they knew how to change the world for the better. As it turned out, they changed it for the worst. So basically, this is how I view what's going on, and this is why the environmentalists are winning, and they will keep on winning, because we are not offering them, they are foot soldiers, we are not offering the foot soldiers anything. We are offering them facts. And what are they to do with their facts? Go home alone and be miserable? Who wants that? We are not offering them anything good. We are offering them the truth. But the truth is mostly useless. It has always been useless. That's it.
So how did they get from equality and justice and making the world a better place to lots of people dead? I'm trying to understand how that happened.
Oh, looking back, it's very easy to see how. It's very logical, actually, because socialism is government ownership of the means of production. To put it in another way, no private property or no free market. I mean, all these, you could use all these as definitions of socialism. They all work because they all amount to the same thing. But it also means that you remove the interest. All of a sudden, the farmer is not working his own land and the crop is not his crop. So he has to be made to work in some other way. And as Napoleon used to say, there are only two factors that determine human behavior. That's fear and interest. And when you remove private property, you removed the interest. You removed the interest. And what you are left with? The fear. And how would you instill fear without beating up people and murdering a large number of people? And actually, the Soviet Union was doing better economically when it was murdering most people per day. On some days, they would reach something like 12,000 people. Overall, something like 62 million were exterminated in the Soviet Union, and that's for a period of 70 years. And when you begin to do the calculations, it turns out that something like a Titanic was sinking per day, every day. And by the way, all these figures are from Rummel, who is the authority on genocide, the American, the late Professor Rummel, the American professor, who dedicated his career to studying these issues. So 76 million exterminated under the Chinese socialism, 62 million exterminated under the Soviet socialism, another 21 million exterminated under the National Socialism. That was the Hitler's brand of socialism. And then there were more millions exterminated in Eastern Europe and in other parts of the world. So this is the logic. You remove, again, to sum it up, if there is no private property, there is no private interest. And therefore, if you remove the interest from the Napoleon's equation, you have to increase the fear. And you cannot have fear unless you murder people. Besides, people are resisting because people don't give up their property and freedoms willingly. It turns out you cannot convince them to do it. Now, people don't understand the word socialism. They apply it willy-nilly to everything these days, just like the word Nazi and the word fascism. Actually, the word has a very specific technical meaning. There is an accepted definition, like I said, government ownership of the means of production. It has been accepted for 200 years more, maybe. And people talk of the socialism in Sweden. Well, there has never been socialism in Sweden. All there has been in Sweden was a generous welfare system and nationalization of certain industries. That was it. But there was still free market. So there was no socialism in Sweden. There was socialism. Whenever there was socialism, Soviet Union, China, Eastern Europe, Nazi Germany, this has always been associated with exterminating a large number of people because it doesn't work any other way. The moment they stopped exterminating people, and that was when I was around in the late 70s and in the 80s, people just didn't care. People just didn't care to work anymore because we were not afraid anymore. People were not disappearing. Actually, we were bragging that we were working less. That was a national sport. And this happened. This is not something peculiar to the Bulgarians, because the same happened to the Germans. Okay, you could say the Bulgarians have always been slack, which is, by the way, not true. Before socialism, they were not slack at all. They were hardworking. They're slack today. But even the Germans, who are not known for being slack, they learned how to skive, how to thief. The same goes for the Czechs, for example. The Czechs are almost Westerners. The Czechs had a colorful saying: if you don't steal from the government, you steal from your family. Have you heard this one?
I have not heard that, no.
Well, this is a Czech saying. Under socialism, they used it. And it sounds as though it has been invented in Bulgaria. I mean, same mentality. And the same went for obviously Russia, Ukraine, same everywhere. Vietnam. The Vietnamese began to rise economically, just like the Chinese, when they introduced capitalism, when they got rid of socialism. Under socialism, things work only by fear. There is no interest, and this requires, by the way, tremendous bureaucracy, because you have to micromanage everybody, because everybody is looking for ways to work less.
So do you think that there is some hope here that this whole climate scam is going to crumble even amongst young people? I heard that they had EU elections and the young people did not vote the way they were supposed to vote, according to the elites. What do you think?
Well, I'm not saying that it's the global warming is a scam.
Okay.
I beg to disagree here with you.
Okay.
I'm in the camp of Margaret Thatcher, who was the first Western politician who began to talk about the global warming. But environmentalism is definitely a scam. So I think that we should begin to distinguish the two, because they're using the global warming as a vehicle to push, like I said, for their own agendas. As for is there hope? Not unless we offer something more than facts. People react to incentives, not to facts. Facts are useless. Facts are in these thick, dusty books nobody ever opens. I mean, look at compare the views under YouTube videos. The views under a YouTube video, which is, say, given by a lecture on physics by a nuclear physics professor, the views would be into several hundred at best. That's all. And then go to a video made by the Kardashians. The views there will be into millions or tens of millions.
Yeah, I do have an update on that Margaret Thatcher thing, because we hear a lot that she believed in it, and she did talk about that in 1989 or so. But I'm going to read you a whole long quote from 2002 in her autobiography, because it's very different. A quote from Thatcher: "The doomster's favorite subject today is climate change. This has a number of attractions for them. First, the science is extremely obscure, so they cannot easily be proved wrong. Second, since clearly no plan to alter climate could be considered on anything but a global scale, it provides a marvelous excuse for worldwide supranational socialism," end quote. So she flipped big time at the end. That's kind of interesting. We don't hear about this quote.
Well, I agree wholeheartedly with every word you just read.
Okay.
I mean, as usual, she was hitting the nail on the head.
Mm-hmm.
This is exactly how things are. And yes, the science is not so simple. I'm not a climatologist myself, so I have nothing valuable here to offer. I haven't studied this problem. It's not in the subject matter of my book. But as far as I know, yes, it's not at all clear what will happen if we continue to pump CO2 in the atmosphere at the rates we do. One thing is certain, that if you increase the CO2, eventually, globally, the temperature will increase. There is hard data on this. But how exactly, and when, and to what degree, none of this is clear. She was spot on. Because all these models, obviously, they're based on methodology. And I have been in the academia for long enough to know that you could reach any results by manipulating the methodology. You could reach a desired result if you choose a certain type of methodology. So all these predictions, all these computer models, I don't take any of this seriously because there is no hard data to support any of this. There is no experimental data. There can hardly be experimental data.
Right.
I mean, let's pause for a second and think what we are talking about here. If you experiment with, say, a bar made of steel, you could run an experiment 50 times or 500 times if you like. You could heat it to different temperatures. You could add certain additives. You could do this or that. You cannot do this with the Earth. By the way, it's the same problem with the so-called social sciences and with the social engineering, which is the arrogant idea that you could design society like you design a railroad bridge. It can never happen. You cannot recreate, say, the Soviet Union 50 times in order to experiment what will happen if you change this here and change that, and in the next experiment something. You never have hard data. So yes, I agree with this part. And I agree, like I said, with everything she said, because she was clever enough not only to grasp the problem from the natural sciences point of view. She was an engineer. She was trained to do that. But she was clever enough to grasp the social and the political implications. And she predicted, from what you read, she predicted very accurately what's going on right now. So I don't see how she contradicts herself, though, because both actually are true. Global warming is a danger, but at the same time, environmentalism is a danger as well. Environmentalism is not a solution. And she was correct on both counts. I don't see a contradiction.
Okay, yeah, this whole climate debate, we can leave that for a separate podcast. But getting back to your other content, I think it's just fantastic. I love listening to a smart, entertaining guy just talk for what? Yeah, fantastic. I'd love to have you back on again. Any other points you'd like to make before we wrap this one up?
Well, since English is not my mother tongue, if you think that I have made myself clear on some points, if you ask me to clarify something, I mean, there was one more thing I missed to talk about, a problem that they usually don't mention when they talk about the renewables. Because usually the conversation is determined by journalists, and journalists are not very, they usually miss the big picture. They're not very well educated. I say this as a former journalist, by the way. I know how it works in newspapers. They would usually report some new breakthrough in the renewables. So many percent, these solar panels are so many percent better, blah, blah, blah. Here's the big picture. The technology could be improved. Any technology could be improved. If you sink enough time and money into it, you could improve it. But you could never get rid of the laws of thermodynamics. The laws of thermodynamics will apply in the 23rd century, just like they apply today. And this matters for the renewables because the renewables are an inherently convoluted way to produce energy. There are too many, they introduce more energy conversions. And any energy conversions, according to the laws of thermodynamics, is associated with energy loss, among other things. You could never make it work on 100%. And let me illustrate this with an example. So take a windmill. The kinetic energy of the wind rotates the blades, and then through the gearbox, this rotational movement, this mechanical energy, so the kinetic energy is converted into rotational mechanical energy, which is converted in the generator into electricity. And if we stop there, in principle, it is not much different than most power stations. Say, the power stations that run on coal. The only difference is that they don't use wind, they use pressurized steam, But this steam also rotates the blades of a turbine. The turbine is in different shape, all that, but these are details. Never mind this. Eventually, this energy is converted into electricity. Here comes the difference. With a coal-powered station, or the nuclear-powered station, by the way, because it would use the same power engine, the same machinery, you could produce the energy when you need it. And with the wind, you produce the energy not when you need it, but when the wind is blowing. By the way, the same applies to the solar. And this means that the excess energy, when you don't need it, has to be stored. And for this, you need a second conversion. You will store, let's say that we will use a battery. Now, this is ridiculous on so many counts. I would not go into how expensive this battery that will power a city will be, how big it will be, what the environmental impact, what the mining required will be. Never mind all this. Let's suppose that we have this unimaginably powerful battery. So you have a conversion of the electricity into the chemical bonds in the battery, into chemical energy, because this is what charging a battery is. It's a chemical process that occurs when you sink energy into it. And then when you need it, you have a yet third conversion. Again, the reverse, chemical bonds to electricity. So you have not one, but three conversions. And this adds inefficiency, like I said. It adds components, adds cost, adds more things that can go wrong, adds more maintenance. So it is not about enough subsidies and enough development. It's an inherently bad idea. Now, I'm not against renewables if somebody wants to develop them himself and pay for it. I guess on some remote island, why not? Or elsewhere, I mean, on private land. It's none of my business to tell who somebody can do with his money. But the problem is that they don't want this. They want us to pay through taxes for their bad ideas. And you see this with any form of social engineering, that they never want to do it themselves. They always want to use public resources for it, because they always know better than the rest. And they're just wasting time, by the way, wasting not just money, but time. The last time I checked, the share of the renewables was around 2% all around the world. It's a bit more in certain countries in the West. It's a bit more when it comes to energy production, but when you take into account the transportation, the heating and all that, it's 2%. Maybe it's a bit more now. And that's after several $1 trillion have been invested, and several hundred billions of dollars of those are direct subsidies from different governments. And the result is pitiful. But of course, they will continue because, like I said, there is emotional side to it. It's not about facts. It's not about numbers. It's about emotions. And this gives many people emotional satisfaction, which we don't give them.
Do you have any specific advice on what we can do to try to make the situation better?
Well, obviously, we cannot use fear. There is one thing that we could do better, and I noticed with your documentary that you're already going there. We could make a better show, because the culture wars and the climate wars are part of the culture wars. They're ultimately show business. People want to be entertained, and they tend to accept something if it's served to them in a more enticing, more entertaining way. And you've achieved that with your documentary. I was impressed by it. It's really entertaining. I mean, it's fun to watch. Fun is the key word here. It's not just about facts. There has to be fun. So if only we could try to organize into communities like they do, into groups, and begin to do PR like they do, to get into the news and begin to make better show, because it's show business, ultimately.
Okay, I'm
So,
glad you mentioned that because Martin Durkin and I are working right now on producing some more short, fun content. So I do think we're on the same wavelength there.
I mean, again, I mentioned already Michael Moore. Michael Moore, his message is disgusting, but it's served in an enticing way. So he is good at this.
He is good. I agree with that. Okay, anything else you'd like to say before we sign off?
Well, again, if something was not explained clearly, please tell me now so that I could maybe elaborate on it.
No, I think it was explained clearly. Yeah, entertaining and clear. I think, yeah, excellent stuff. Great.
Well, I don't know how entertaining it is. I hope you are not just being courteous.
I am not.
My girlfriend will disagree with you. She doesn't think I'm entertaining. She thinks me tedious.
Well, yeah, but
By the way, I can hear her laughing in the background.
Okay, well, at least you've got me on your side. So, okay, thanks a lot. I really enjoyed this, and I would love to do this again. So, well, let's do it again.
Me too. Thank you.
All right, we'll talk to you later. Vladislav
See you
Bogorov.
later.
Goodbye.
Thank you.